I wanted to talk about Raising Cain, Brian De Palma's thriller starring John Lithgow, Lolita Davidovich, Stephen Bauer, and Greg Henry. Definitely one of Brian De Palma's low key thrillers. But even though it's low key, it's kind of an important film in his career for a couple of reasons. But before I go into that, I just brief description. Like I say, it's kind of a psychological thriller about a man who's married with a child, and he's married to Lolita Davidovich. They have a daughter, and you know he's kind of well, his dad is a child psychologist who's supposed to be deceased. His father is, and but some of the traits have sort of trickled down to the son. So John Lithgow really dotes on his daughter, and takes special care of their child, much to Lolita Davidovich's discomfort, shall we say. Um, Something's missing essentially in their marriage, so Lolita Davidovich's character kind of ends up being involved with an old flame played by Stephen Bauer. And ultimately, this triggers John Lithgow's character into kind of a psychological breakdown of sorts. His character, we find out pretty early on, so it's not a spoiler, but we find out pretty early on he has a split personality. In fact, the poster says something along the lines of when he finds out that his wife is cheating on him, he doesn't just leave, he splits. A little joke there, but it's interesting. The film itself is not only directed by Brian De Palma, but written totally by Brian De Palma. And even though there's a lot of mumbo jumbo, and De Palma even admits that a lot of it's just sort of made up psychobabble, it might be his most intelligent script that he's written. Like it might be it's certainly the most has the most depth, I guess you would say, in terms of dialogue and I mean a lot of stuff underneath the surface in this film. Ultimately, it's a tour de force for John Lithgow. I mean, how could Lithgow refuse this role because he gets to play essentially so many characters, even if they might be in his head. So, but it's your typical sort of classic Brian De Palma thriller. I say low key because not a lot of people even talk about it or think about it. They don't talk about it like they do, say, Blowout or even Body Double, or even Snake Eyes. But it's a fine thriller, and there's actually two versions of it: the theatrical version and what is called sort of the director's cut. Originally, Brian De Palma started the story with Lolita's narrative first, and then it goes into John Lithgow's narrative, and then it all comes together in a third act. And it's very much like the way Janet Leigh's narrative begins Psycho, or Angie Dickinson's narrative begins Dressed to Kill. This is how original Raising Cain was supposed to begin. But at the last minute, De Palma decided it might be a little too confusing because the way the original script was written, it's a little bit, what's the word I want to use? Non-linear, kind of like a lot of Christopher Nolan films are non-linear, right? Um, including Oppenheimer, which goes back and forth between the creation of the atomic bomb and these hearings, and and of course Christopher Nolan has made a career now of nonlinear films. But at the time, the original script, Raising Cain, was very nonlinear. It would have essentially a flashback kind of in the middle of the film. But anyway, Brian De Palma thought that, well, this is already a bit, complex. Why confuse people even more? So, to make it more linear, he began the film with John Lithgow's narrative. And as the years went on, De Palma kind of regretted that, and sort of wished he had gone back and just and edited it the way it was originally supposed to be. Now, Raising Cain did really well. In fact, it's a low budget film, or at least a lower budget film than a lot of Brian De Palma's films. But it made 4 times its budget at the box office. So, in that respect, it was a big hit for him. And critically, it did okay. For most Brian De Palma films, when they're released, they usually get pretty mixed reviews. Even some of his, films that are now considered classics. But Raising Cain got generally good reviews, and nonetheless, he kind of regretted over the years making that sort of last minute change. Well, some European filmmaker who's a big fan of Brian De Palma's got a hold of the original script, and he was able to edit the film into as closely as he could into the original, or the film as it was originally intended. In other words, he shifted it, he restructured it so that the movie actually does begin with Lolita Davidovich's narrative. And somehow Brian De Palma caught wind of this. I don't know if he was sent the copy or what, but once he saw it, he loved it, and he contacted a Blu-ray release company. What was it? It was the Shout Factory, and they decided, probably did a few tweaks here and there, made it much more seamless, and they have released a special edition Blu-ray that features both the theatrical version and the renewed so-called director's cut. And I have to say, I do like the director's cut even more. I don't mind that it's non-linear. Again, thanks to directors like Christopher Nolan, we're kind of accustomed now to that non-linear format. So it works really well in the director's cut of Raising Cain. And I've always loved the idea of starting with Lolita Davidovich's narrative, because in a weird way, it just balances things out. She feels as much a part of the story as John Lithgow now. Whereas before, when it began with Lithgow's narrative, it just felt more like it was John Lithgow's film. Now it's much more balanced and much more even-keeled between the two characters. And they're both excellent in the film, of course. And of course, I highly recommend it. Like I say, very well written. It's just a fun psychological thriller. If you want to see a really great, grand performance from John Lithgow, this is the movie. I mean, I can't think of another movie where John Lithgow gets to have this much fun, and he's had a lot of fun in other films too. But the reason why this is such an important film, it's kind of a linchpin film for Brian De Palma, because he had been very successful in the 80s, Dressed to Kill in 1980. Blowout was not a financial success, and it got mixed reviews. Now, of course, is considered, one of his greatest, if not his greatest film. Dressed to Kill was a huge hit. Of course, he made Body Double, which is now, again, another film that's now considered a classic, or at least a cult classic. But he made The Untouchables in 1987. Now, that was a huge hit for Brian De Palma. And it was highly acclaimed, did really well at the box office, got a few Academy Award nominations. And so he could kind of do whatever he wanted after that. And so he made his most important film, in my opinion, one of his absolute greatest films in Casualties of War, which was a pretty big budget film in Southeast Asia about a true life incident that took place during the Vietnam War. Very hard to watch film. I just it's one of my favorite films, but it lost money at the box office. It just bombed. It shouldn't have. It's one of the best war films, or you might even want to call it an anti-war film that you'll ever see, but it bombed at the box office. And he was kind of devastated by it. I mean, because it was really a film that he put his heart and soul into. And so he follows that up with an even bigger bomb, a movie called Bonfire of the Vanities, based on a very famous novel that was sought after. The studio really wanted to make this film, but it was also a novel that many thought just frankly couldn't be made into a film realistically. Brian De Palma tried. It was a fairly big budget, and it tanked with the critics. I mean, even Casualties of War was at least critically acclaimed. This tanked with the critics, and it did horrible at the box office. And after two box office bombs in a row, even Brian De Palma, even a great director, a great auteur like Brian De Palma, started to second guess himself and asked himself if he could direct a good film anymore. And so finally, he just decided to go back to the basics, back to what's always worked for him. And that's a psychological thriller, a kind of, if you will, Hitchcockian style psychological thriller. So he sat down and he wrote this script. He knew he was going to make it with a very modest budget. And he's got these great friends, John Lithgow, who he's worked with multiple times, Greg Henry, who he's worked with multiple times, and Stephen Bauer, who he was good friends with, and he's worked with a couple of times, and he was able to round those folks up, plus some other actors, some character actors, and some people who certainly were interested in working with Brian De Palma, Lolita Davidovich, and Frances Sternhagen, who was a great character actress, and he, they just created sort of this modest but very crazy psychological thriller. It's fun from start to finish, and even though the budget is fairly low, it's got those classic De Palma set pieces and cinematography, and there's a great one shot where a lot of exposition is going on, and the camera is without a single cut. The camera is following these actors down this staircase and into an elevator and down into the morgue area, and it's all, like I say, it's uncut, and it's just one of those great Brian De Palma staples. And you've got the Pino Donaggio score. I think Stephen Burum, who's an old favorite of Brian's, did the cinematography, and it ended up, like I said, it ended up being a nice hit for Brian De Palma. And the reason why this is important is it kind of jump-started his career after those two bombs. And frankly, I hate to even call Casualties of War a bomb because it was such a great film. It is such a great film. But The success of Raising Cain allowed Brian De Palma to follow that up with one of his greatest films, Carlito's Way, with Al Pacino, Sean Penn, and Penelope Ann Miller. I mean, truly one of his greatest films. And then he follows that up with maybe his biggest box office hit, Mission Impossible. So, to me, Raising Cain has to have a special place in Brian De Palma's, heart. Certainly a special place for me as a fan, because I know this movie might just have saved his career because it was able to lead to a hell of a bounce back after two movies that bombed so badly would probably have killed the career of any other director. So, kudos to Raising Cain. I highly recommend if you can get your hands on the director's cut of the film, please do so. And I think you'll enjoy this twisted, wicked psychological thriller.